Before the 20th century, most American cities had no real control over their water pressure. As demand grew, powerful steam pumps pushed water through aging pipe networks with little regulation. The result? Burst pipes, damaged mains, and contaminated drinking water. To fix this, engineers installed vertical pipes hundreds of feet tall, called standpipes, that absorbed pressure surges and stabilized the system. Most were hidden inside simple brick towers, but in St. Louis, the city did something quite different. Here, standpipes became public architecture. Between 1871 and 1898, St. Louis built 3 massive masonry towers, each housing a standpipe designed to regulate flow and protect the city's expanding infrastructure. They were built to impress, and they did. More than a century later, they're still standing. So why did St. Louis invest so heavily in these structures? How do they work, and why do they still exist here, long after every other city has torn theirs down? Stay tuned to find out, as today we uncover the fascinating story of St. Louis's forgotten standpipes. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's go back to the early 1800s, when St. Louis was little more than a riverside hub for fur traders and steamboats. In these days, its population hovered around 5,000, and like many American cities at the time, it had no formal water system. Residents relied on wells or barrels of river water delivered by wagon. The Mississippi was the city's lifeline and liability. In 1831, the city's first piped water system was launched by a private company using steam pumps and wooden pipes made from hollowed-out logs. Water was pulled directly from the river and sent untreated to homes and businesses alike. The system was underpowered, unfiltered, and vulnerable to seasonal flooding and pollution. But for a city still in its infancy, it worked, barely. St. Louis didn't stay small for long. In the decades that followed, it grew into one of the largest cities in the United States. The arrival of the railroads in the 1850s and its role as a supply center during the Civil War turned it into a major inland port and manufacturing base. By 1860, the population had passed 160,000, and the city had outgrown its water infrastructure completely. Hence, that same year, the city took over its failing private waterworks, forming a municipal water division. The new leadership brought in engineer Thomas Whitman, brother of poet Walt Whitman, to overhaul the system. Whitman pushed for better pressure, cleaner intake, and modern materials. One of his major accomplishments was the development of the Bissell Point Waterworks, completed in 1868. This ingenious new system used a submerged tunnel to draw river water in, and then powerful steam engines to pump it uphill to newly laid mains across the city. This was a milestone, but it came with a new set of problems. Steam-powered pumps delivered water in powerful surges, and the early grid, well, it lacked any way to regulate them. Pipes burst, faucets sputtered, entire blocks lost service during peak hours, and so on. At the same time, elevation changes across the city created inconsistent flow. The higher neighborhoods were often dry, while the low-lying areas often risked overflow. With that in mind, engineers experimented with pressure zones, gravity-fed reservoirs, and elevation tanks. The Compton Hill Reservoir, completed in 1871, was one such effort, built high above the city to serve Southside neighborhoods. But even with reservoirs acting as buffers, the city still needed a way to stabilize pressure at the point of delivery. The solution came from a relatively simple technology: the standpipe. A standpipe is just what it sounds like: a vertical pipe connected to the distribution system. When pressure surged from the pumps, water could rise inside the pipe instead of blowing out the mains. As demand fluctuated throughout the day, the standpipe absorbed the changes and maintained a steady flow across the system. It was an elegant fix to a growing problem. And by the late 1860s, it was standard practice in larger American cities. But in St. Louis, the standpipe would be taken one step further. You see, instead of hiding it, the city decided to house its first standpipe inside of a beautiful architectural tower, one that would be visible for miles. This choice wasn't just about function. It reflected how serious the city had begun taking their water system, not only as infrastructure, but as a general public investment. And so it was. By 1871, the first tower would rise over North Grand Avenue. When the city of St. Louis began planning its first standpipe tower in the late 1860s, the decision to make it beautiful was both functional and symbolic. The standpipe inside would serve a critical engineering purpose, stabilizing water pressure from the Bissell Point pumping station. But the structure itself would also stand in public view, right on Grand Avenue. For that reason, the city hired George I. Burnett, arguably the most prominent architect in St. Louis at the time. Burnett delivered a classical solution. The Grand Avenue water tower was modeled after a Corinthian column, a form typically found in Roman temples, not Midwestern infrastructure. Completed in 1871, it stood 154 feet tall and was built with a brick shaft resting on a Chicago stone base, all crowned by a cast iron capital shaped like a ring of acanthus leaves. The standpipe inside was 5 feet in diameter, reaching nearly the full height of the structure. The project cost $45,000, an enormous sum for the pressure regulation devices of the time, but the city saw this move as an investment. The tower wasn't just solving a technical problem, it was making a statement that public infrastructure could be engineered for performance and designed for civic pride. When the tower opened, it was met with broad approval. Local newspapers praised its elegance, and residents began referring to it as the Old White Tower. For nearly half a century, the Grand Avenue standpipe performed its job reliably, but by 1912, advances in pump technology rendered it obsolete. From there, the inner workings of the standpipe and its internal staircase were removed, and the structure was decommissioned. It could have easily been demolished, but it wasn't. Rather, the city found new uses. In the 1920s and 30s, an aircraft beacon was added to the top, reportedly used by pilots, including, according to local legend at least, Charles Lindbergh, when navigating through the fog near the Mississippi River. Though, and not to spoil the romance here, it's far more likely that this beacon was a simple warning light for low-flying planes. Anyhow, in 1933, when a city report suggested tearing down the tower, public backlash was swift. The mayor of the time, Bernard Dickman, intervened saying, quote, "To wreck this tower would, to my mind, verge closely on an act of sacrilege." And with that, the tower was spared. Today, the Grand Avenue Tower is the tallest freestanding Corinthian column in the world. It's also listed on the National Register of Historic Places and remains a fixture of the College Hill neighborhood. Though the standpipe inside is long gone, the structure remains, reflecting a combination of industrial utility and architectural ambition. But the story of St. Louis's standpipes doesn't end here. So let's go back to the 1880s to see what they would build next. By the mid-1880s, the Grand Avenue standpipe was no longer enough. The expansion of the Bissell Point pumping station had dramatically increased capacity, and the Northern District of St. Louis now needed their own pressure regulation tower. The city responded with a new project, one larger, taller, and unmistakably different in design. Completed in 1886, the second tower was constructed at the corner of Bissell Street and Blair Avenue, just blocks from the pumping station it supported. Designed by William S. Eames, then serving as Deputy Commissioner of Public Buildings, the tower was both a product of function and architectural vision. Though, unlike the Grand Avenue Tower's classical design, the Bissell structure was vertical, angular, and bold, with red brick walls, gray stone trim, and a Moorish-style observation deck atop. Of course, on the inside, the tower housed a vertical standpipe reaching nearly 200 feet in height. Its job was the same: absorb surges from high-service pumps and stabilize water pressure from the surrounding neighborhoods. But with the city now pushing towards modern waterworks designs, the new tower represented a shift towards more robust industrial aesthetics. It was also more expensive, costing the city nearly $80,000, a sizable investment at the time. Even so, the tower quickly became a familiar part of the landscape. Also located in College Hill, it sat at the center of a residential grid that was still developing. Newspaper articles of the time cited this tower as evidence that the north side was receiving the same level of infrastructure as the city's south and central districts, with residents also seeming to like the tower, as it was reported that some chose to build their house in a similar architectural design, giving the city a general and interesting harmony. Despite its prominence, the Bissell Tower was retired from service just 27 years later. As you may recall from the previous chapter, by 1913, new technology made standpipes obsolete, and the tower's practical use came to an end. What remained, however, was a deep local attachment. So when a plan emerged in 1958 to demolish the structure, rather than fund repairs, it was stopped cold by a wave of public opposition. Donald Gunn, then president of the Board of Aldermen, furiously said, quote, "I was raised within a block of that tower and used to run around it in my bare feet," end quote. Apparently, this notion ended the debate. In the 1960s, the structure fell into disrepair again. This time, instead of tearing it down, the city opted for preservation. A grant from the U.S. Department of Interior, matched by local funds, paid for a full renovation in the 1970s. The interior standpipe had long been removed, but the tower was structurally stabilized and restored as a civic landmark. Today, the 194-foot-tall Bissell Tower is the second oldest of St. Louis's 3 remaining standpipes. So now it's time to go back to the 1890s to learn about the last remaining pressure zone that St. Louis needed to protect: Compton Hill. By the late 1890s, the south side of St. Louis was booming. Streetcars, brick housing, and urban parks were all extending deep into Compton Heights and Tower Grove. But despite that growth, the area still lacked reliable water pressure, meaning the city needed yet another standpipe tower, one capable of regulating flow from the southernmost pressure zone. Completed in 1898, the Compton Hill Water Tower was the third and final standpipe built in St. Louis. Architect Harvey Ellis designed the structure while working under George R. Mann, a leading figure in Midwestern public architecture. Their design was ambitious: French Romanesque style rendered in buff brick, rusticated limestone and terracotta, with carved foliage and mythical beasts wrapping the facade. The tower stood 179 feet tall and housed a 6-foot diameter, 130-foot vertical standpipe. Like its predecessors, the tower absorbed the pressure surges created by pumps, reducing stress on the entire system and allowing an even greater flow of water throughout southern St. Louis. The structure cost $48,000 to build, which was yet another major expense for the time, but one seen as essential to the safe operation of the city's expanding water grid. From the start, the tower drew attention. Built at the crest of one of the city's highest natural points, it quickly became a civic landmark. Its observation deck, accessible by spiral stairs, offered panoramic views of the growing city and proved especially popular during the 1904 World's Fair. On busier weekends, visitors would promenade through Reservoir Park in horse-drawn carriages, climbing the tower for views that stretched for miles. But like the towers that came before it, Compton Hill's standpipe was made obsolete by that never-ending march of progress. In 1929, the tower was decommissioned when the Howard Bend plant and Stacy Park Reservoir came online. The elevation of that new system created way too much static head, causing the Compton standpipe to overflow during nighttime low-demand periods, which was a completely unacceptable waste of potable water, but also caused risk to the sewer infrastructure, which had to take up the excess. So after its retirement, the tower was used intermittently for public events and even served as a radio antenna base for the city's water department fleet dispatch through the 1980s. By the mid-1990s, however, it had fallen into disrepair, and demolition was on the table. Public outcry followed. Preservationists and local residents formed the Water Tower and Park Preservation Society, which partnered with the city on a full-scale restoration completed in 1999. The $19 million project stabilized the structure and reopened it to visitors on select weekends. Today, only 7 standpipe towers survive in the United States, and 3 of them are in St. Louis. Elsewhere, they were decommissioned as soon as they became obsolete, too large, costly, and unfamiliar to preserve. But in St. Louis, they were kept, not for utility, but because people saw them as something more, part of the city's civic fabric, whereas the engineering that replaced them was invisible. By the early 20th century, water systems had moved onto closed-loop controls, pressure valves, and advanced pump regulators. These new technologies could do in inches what standpipes required hundreds of feet to imagine, but none of them were designed to be admired, and none were made in public view. They're just functional tools. As for these old towers, well, by some miracle, they remained in the skyline of St. Louis, in postcards and local lore. Over the years, they've been featured in art exhibitions, wedding proposals, documentaries, and even on t-shirts sold at city festivals. Despite that, most people don't even know what they are. They're often mistaken as steeples or chimneys. So, at a minimum, I hope that we've managed to clear up any misconceptions. And we'll leave it there for today, but if you'd like to catch early releases of episodes like this one, please consider joining our Patreon community. As you've probably learned from our episodes, everything, including this channel, has a rise and a fall. And though we're not at the fall yet, when we get there, I want to make sure that I have a direct line to our most dedicated viewers. So I've introduced a new Patreon level. It's pretty cheap. You can get these episodes early, keep in touch, and guarantee that when this channel is in legacy, well, we'll still keep the show going. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.